When you mention the word type in the Bible, it's not merely speaking of the letters on the page like the font or the type, but a biblical type usually speaks of an Old Testament figure, either a person or a thing, that foreshadows a New Testament reality. Usually that figure is revealing some reality that centers around Christ. For example, Adam, being the perfect man, was a type of Christ himself. In the book of Romans, Jesus is called the second Adam because Jesus is the perfect man who walked the earth in complete harmony with God. Adam was not Christ Jesus himself, but was merely a type of Christ. Another example would be the Ark of Noah. The ark itself was a type of Christ also, because the ark was the Savior of the world. Everyone who was in the ark when the destruction occurred, well, they were saved. And everyone who is in Christ, they'll be saved also when destruction occurs. The ark is obviously not Christ, but is merely a type of Christ, and it's a good type. The type reveals the future reality very well, and types give us great insight into future realities. Our story this evening here in Genesis chapter 22 is one of the greatest types in the Old Testament of the sacrifice of Jesus. Chapter 22 speaks heavily of both submission and sacrifice. And there are two types in this story that take the center stage. These are the two main characters of this chapter. That's Abraham and Isaac. Isaac, the child of promise, is obviously a beautiful type of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And Abraham, as we'll see here in more detail, is a beautiful type of the Father, a type of God the Father. In Genesis chapter 22, in verse 1, it reads, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham," or God had put Abraham to the test. "And God said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." Now, the type here is clearly seen in that this sacrifice of Isaac foreshadows the reality of the sacrifice of Jesus. Isaac is a type of Christ. But let's go over this story here and get the full picture. The first thing that you'll notice here in verse 1 is that Abraham was tested. That King James word, tempt, is not really a good modern translation of the Hebrew word nasa, but the better word would be the word test, since this is certainly a testing of Abraham's faith. So you could word it that Abraham's faith was put to the test. Now, what I find to be extremely interesting is that the Hebrew word nasa, it does mean to put to the test or to prove the substance of something, but this particular Hebrew word speaks of testing by smell or to try by odor. It's as though God was getting a good smell of Abraham's faith to see if it was rotten or if this burnt offering that God had asked Abraham for would be a sweet-smelling aroma in his nostrils. Abraham's faith is being put to the test. Now, I had also mentioned that this chapter was about submission. And if you are to be the servant of God, God definitely wants a submissive servant. I think that the way that we exercise submission in the practical application of our lives is in another S word, and that's the word surrender. And it's not merely giving up a few items, a little bit of money, or a couple of behavioral changes, but are you willing to surrender your rights over to God? Are you willing to allow God to put his finger on the most sensitive areas of your heart, that area that's still in rebellion to him, and surrender it over to the Lord in humble service and humble submission? God will put all of us to the test. That is, if you are his servant, he will. He'll touch the areas that you're not surrendering to him, and he'll bring them to the surface very painfully at times. And he'll ask, is this how you want to live? Will you hold on to this attitude of the heart concerning this thing? Or will you surrender it over to me and see what I can do? Even before I show you the blessing, can you surrender it over to me? Abraham was asked back in Ur of the Chaldees over 50 years ago to surrender his homeland, to surrender his brothers and sisters, all of his kinsmen, and even to surrender his father in obedience to the Lord, and follow his leading even before he saw the blessing of where God wanted to lead him. At first, Abraham was asked to surrender his father, and now Abraham is asked to surrender his son. In verse 2, it reads that the Lord had commanded him, "Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." From Ur of the Chaldees, up until this time when Isaac was a lad, as it reads in verse 5, Abraham's faith would be tested. Abraham hadn't been perfect, but he did surrender the well-watered plains of Jordan to follow God's leading. He also surrendered all the spoil that the king of Sodom had offered him, so that he might fully depend upon the Lord for his sustenance. In our last chapter, we saw that Abraham had at one time surrendered a well of fresh water to some of Abimelech's men so that he would be a peacemaker. But here at Moriah, the father, Abraham, is put to the most challenging test that he ever faced. Here at Moriah, the father, Abraham, was asked to offer up his only son, whom thou lovest so dearly, is what God said, as a burnt offering. Remember that a burnt offering speaks of devotion, dedication, or surrender. Will Abraham surrender his son? In verse 3, it reads, "And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and the knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father? And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Now, I had mentioned before that Isaac was a lad, as far as it reads in verse 5. And I think that we can somewhat determine the age of Isaac by this Hebrew word for lad. It's the word na'ar. So far in our studies through the book of Genesis, this word na'ar has been used specifically for young men. The first mention is back in chapter 14, where Abraham was describing some of the young men, or the na'ar, or the na'ar, that went with him to fight in the battle against the 4 kings of the east. These weren't infants or little children, but they were fighting men, probably past their teens. In chapter 18, it was a na'ar, or a young man, who went and slaughtered and prepared a young calf for the Lord and the 2 angels that were there for the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then in chapter 21, this same word is used to describe Ishmael when he was 16 or 17 years old. And I mention this because some people have the idea that Isaac was just a small child when he was offered as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. In the Jewish Encyclopedia, this event is called the Akedah, or the Akedah. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it sounds like the Akedah. One commentator, Jose ben Zimra, believes that the Akedah took place immediately after Isaac's weaning, which would make him about 2 or 3 years old. But at 2 or 3 years old, they usually don't carry the wood, nor do they ask the question where the sacrifice is. And they're usually not referred to as the na'ar. Many of the Jewish rabbis believe that the Akedah not only coincided with, but was the cause of the death of Sarah, who was informed of Abraham's intention while he and Isaac were on the way to Mount Moriah. Therefore, Isaac must have been 37 years old. But we're not sure of his exact age. It seems to be somewhere in between his late teens and his mid-30s. And since Isaac is a type of Christ, I would say it was more likely that he was in his early 30s. And like I had said before, Isaac is a type of Christ in this story. And Abraham is a type of God the Father in this story. In a few other passages in the Old Testament, the perspective of the sufferings of Calvary are given from the perspective of the Son. In Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6, it reads, "I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting." And in Psalm 22, verses 12 through 16, it reads, and this is the perspective coming from the Son of the suffering of the sacrifice. In Psalm 22, 12 through 16, it reads, "Many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." So both of these passages from the book of Isaiah and from the Psalms are vivid descriptions of the agony and suffering of the cross, as seen from the perspective of Jesus, the Son of God. But here in Genesis chapter 22, I believe that the emphasis of this perspective is seen more through the eyes of God the Father, as the emphasis of this story focuses more on Abraham and his determination to offer the required sacrifice. So we get to see the heart of God the Father in offering his own Son as a sacrifice also. In verse 6, It reads that both the Father and the Son went together unto the place where the son of promise would be offered. Abraham shows great faith and obedience by rising early in the morning, as it reads in verse 3, taking his son, taking all the provisions needed to offer a proper sacrifice, and then heading to the place where God had shown him. Abraham didn't shrink back at the commandment of God, but he was determined to do his will apart from his own. And Isaac also, he was obedient to the will of his own father, Abraham. Isaac, being in his early 30s, may not have been aware of the purpose of this venture at first, but he doesn't struggle and he doesn't contend as the event unfolds. And he sees what God has required of both Abraham and of himself, of Isaac. You know, this story has to be put alongside the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus had come into the garden with a few of the young men in his company also, and he told them to tarry here as he went a little further, and he fell on his face, and he sweat, as it were, great drops of blood from his brow. Leaving the young men behind, the Father and the Son, they went alone to provide a sacrifice, an atonement for sin. And you can see the Father and the Son in a conversation in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was already bearing the burden of the morning's event when he asked his Father if there could be any other possible way besides the altar. Could there be another route apart from the cross of Calvary and the shame and the sacrifice that awaited there? He said, if there is any other way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. The conversation is seen in our story in Genesis where Isaac asks his father, where is the lamb, my father? I'm burdened with the wood. I see the knife in your hand and the fire to consume the burnt offering, but where is the lamb? And Abraham says, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And as much as the father was determined to offer the sacrifice, his heart must have broke right alongside his dear son, his only son, whom he loved so greatly. The father shared the anguish of his son in the garden. And as the arresting soldiers came for Jesus, they both went together, the Father and the Son, to that place, the hill of Calvary, the place of the skull, or what was once called Mount Moriah. In verse 9, it reads, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar of the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And an angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And I imagine he said this with great tears in his eyes, raising the knife above his son Isaac. And God said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Also in the Jewish encyclopedia, some rabbis believed that at this time, since Isaac was cooperating with this event, that he hid himself while Abraham was preparing the wood so that Satan couldn't throw a rock at him and damage him so that he wouldn't be an acceptable sacrifice. It's written that way in the Jewish Encyclopedia. And then he asked his father to bind his hands so that he couldn't escape from being the sacrifice if he were tempted further by Satan. I just thought that was an interesting comment. So God says, you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. You've passed the test, Abraham. A sweet-smelling savor of faith radiates from your very being. I indeed will provide myself a sacrifice, just as you have so accurately predicted, Abraham. Verse 13, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Jehovah-Jireh wasn't a name that Abraham had given to God, but rather it was a name that was given to the place where Abraham stood. Jehovah-Jireh means the personal name of God, Jehovah, and then Jireh means sees, or you could translate that word Jireh as provides. God himself will provide in this place. And the place that was called Jehovah-Jireh was Mount Moriah, the very hill of Calvary where the Father and the Son would go together some 1900 years later, and there the Son would be offered, the Son of God would be offered as a sacrifice for sin. I think this story gives us a very saddening glimpse of the heart of God the Father in the offering of his Son. I had said that the Father must have shared the agony of the Son in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then in the shame and the spitting and the mocking and the buffeting, or the abuse that Jesus the Son endured on the way to the cross. The Father had never left him nor forsaken him. They both had gone together to the hill of Moriah where God had provided himself as an offering. And I believe that this was a very tense moment for Abraham, but it's light compared to the intensity of the heart of God the Father in turning away for that one brief moment where the sin of the whole world would be laid upon his Son on the cross, on Jesus. And Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And if there were any tears in heaven, it would be the tears of the Father in giving his Son. I can only imagine Abraham's tears when he took that ram that was caught by his horns in the thicket, and he cut its throat, and he watched the blood flow out of it as the life flowed out of it, as the offering that God had provided. And I'm sure it was with many tears that Abraham had laid even that substitutionary sacrifice on the altar. And God the Father, he had no substitute, no ram to offer in the place of his own dear Son, Jesus. There was no voice from heaven telling anyone to stop. Don't lay a hand on the lad. But there was a voice from the cross that said, "It is finished." And again, Jesus said from the cross, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And he gave up the ghost as he offered himself as a sacrifice for sin. And he glorified his Father in heaven by his good deed in offering his own life as a sacrifice. In verse 15, it reads, "And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself I have sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thee. I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelt at Beersheba." In verse 18, that word seed is singular. This was another confirmation of the promise to Abraham, that in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Abraham knew that God had to fulfill this promise through Isaac, his only son, of whom the seed, singular, would eventually come. And all nations would be blessed through Jesus, the seed of Isaac. You know, Abraham was a man of great faith. And he said to the young men beforehand, "We shall go and worship, and then return again unto you." Abraham knew that God would have to raise his son from the dead in order to fulfill his promise to bless all nations through him. Even if God had to raise his son from the dead, he would, to fulfill his promise. Once again, Abraham passed the test. And as James says in the book of James, it's not by a said faith alone, but it was Abraham's action of obedience coupled together with his faith that Abraham was justified in the eyes of the Lord. In James chapter 2, verses 21 through 24, it reads, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works, when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God." You see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. You know, a faith that has no action that's coupled together with that faith, well, that's just a dead faith. It's an empty profession. But all true faith has a work alongside it that proves that faith. An aroma of obedience. God said that in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Obedience to the known will of God proves your faith. And I would ask that God would find all of us faithfully doing his will. And like I said before, this goes far beyond just giving up a few bad habits or giving money to the offering plate, into the offering plate, or performing some religious activity. This is a total surrender of your will. And it must show itself in obedience. A surrender of your will that must show itself in sacrifice. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 12, verses 25 and 26, Jesus said, "He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto eternal life." If any man serve me, let him follow me, and where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor. Verse 20, and it came to pass after these things, that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, she hath also borne children unto thy brother Nahor, Huz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aram, and Chesed, and Hazo. That sounds like a name people would name their child today. Hazo. And Pildash. That doesn't sound like a name anybody would pick, though. Pildash. And Jidlaph, and Bethuel, and Bethel begot Rebekah. These 8 Milcah did bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother. And his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she bare also Teba, and Gaham, and Thahash, and Maacah. Nahor was Abraham's brother, who was left back in Ur of the Chaldees. Haran had died in Ur. That was Abraham's other brother. But Nahor was still there having children, and obviously a lot of them. Now, these names might not seem very important right now, and most of them aren't repeated again in the Bible. But one name that's going to come up real soon is the name Rebekah. Rebekah was Abraham's brother's daughter. That was Abraham's niece. And Isaac and Rebekah were cousins. In chapter 24, we'll see that they become kissing cousins. They actually get married to one another, which seems kind of gross to us, but it was very acceptable at this time in history. In fact, in many Eastern nations, still today, marriage between cousins is quite normal. And actually, this was quite a normal thing even in early America, for people to marry their cousin. So, anyway, in Genesis chapter 23 and verse 1, it reads, And Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. And these were the years of the life of Sarah, 127 years old. And Sarah died in Kirjath-Arba, the same as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. The name Kirjath-Arba means the cry of Arba. In Joshua chapter 14, it tells us that Arba, this is a man's name, that he was a great man in Canaan, and he was the father of the giants, the Anakims. So this place was named after him. And after Israel had taken the land under Joshua's leadership, they changed the name of this place, Kirjath-Arba, to Hebron. In verse 3 it says, And Abraham stood up from before his dead, and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my lord. Thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to all the people of the land, even to the children of Heth. And he communed with them, saying, If it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat me to Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he hath, which is in the end of his field, for as much money as it is worth, he shall give it me for a possession of a burying place among you. Now, the sons of Heth are the Hittites. All of these tribes are these small nations within Canaan. They don't become the enemies of God's people until they come to take the land in the book of Joshua when they finally went into that promised land. Now, Noah's son Ham bore a son named Canaan. And Canaan is the founder of this whole area just east of the Mediterranean Sea. And Canaan had 12 sons, which became the tribes of Canaan. His one son, Heth, was the father of the Hittites. And God names them specifically as one of the nations that Israel was to drive out of the land when they came into it for a possession. But here in this story, Abraham is bartering with the sons of Heth over a piece of land that he would like to purchase from a man named Ephron. At first, the sons of Heth, they tell Abraham, "You are a mighty prince in the land, Abraham. No one would deny you his empty sepulcher." But Abraham says, "I don't want one of your burying places. I want a place that I can set aside for generations to come, that I could call my own." It may have been that in their thinking, once Abraham, the stranger among us, is dead and gone, his name will be forgotten in the land, and his grave, and the grave of his wife, and his one son, Isaac. They'll all be forgotten. And Isaac, he just happened to be some 30 years old right now, and he didn't have any children. He didn't have a wife. And so they might have thought that Abraham's name and his graves would just mix in with the rest of forgotten history. But Abraham said, "No, I want this place that I can call my own, so that all the generations of my descendants can come and they would know where we were laid to rest." And so I think that this is a tremendous act of faith on Abraham's part. And so this request, it looked far into the future. That's great faith. But this going back and forth over the piece of land was a common bartering tactic in the Middle East. "You can have any one of our sepulchers, Abraham." And Abraham said, "I'd like this small piece of land at the end of the field of Ephron." And they said, "You want it? Go ahead, it's yours. It's a gift." And then Abraham says, "As much as the field is worth, I'll pay for it." And they said, "No, it's a gift from us to you." and this bartering, it just goes back and forth. In verse 10, it reads, "And Ephron dwelled among the children of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even of all that went in at the gate of the city, saying, Nay, my Lord, hear me. The field give I thee, and the cave that is therein I give it thee. In the presence of the sons of my people give I it thee. Bury thy dead." And Abraham bowed himself before the people of the land, and he spake unto Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, "But if thou wilt give it, I pray thee, hear me. I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there." And Ephron answered Abraham, saying unto him, "My Lord, hearken unto me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead." So they're finally agreeing to a price, and you can see this just going back and forth. But I think they conducted their business in this manner so that they could be free from any accusation of offending one another. Hospitality was of great importance at this time in the Middle East. And so if I said things with a very generous front, then I could always refer back to my generosity and kindness during our bargaining if anything came up in question later on, just like Abimelech did in the last chapter. Now, a shekel was equal to the weight of 20 beans. That's how they measured out what a shekel was. It was equal to the weight of 20 beans. Or a modern day estimation is that a shekel is worth a quarter, which would mean that Abraham got this little piece of land for $100, or 400 shekels of silver. And that sounds like, honestly, a dirt cheap price for this piece of dirt. In verse 16, and Abraham hearkened unto Ephron, and Abraham weighed to Ephron the silver, which he had named in the audience of the sons of Heth, which means that he had a public witness to verify this transaction. And he weighed out 400 shekels of silver, current money, with the merchant. So even though Abraham was a man of great faith, that doesn't mean that he was a pushover in business matters or in financial matters. His heart is fixed on eternity, but he's a wise steward in the here and now. In Proverbs 10:16, it reads, the earnings of the godly enhance their lives, but evil people squander their money on sin. And in Proverbs 31, where it speaks of the godly woman, it reads in Proverbs 31, starting at verse 14, she is like the merchant's ships. She bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. Now, Abraham wasn't a woman, obviously, but he was buying this field for a very godly woman, for Sarah, his wife. And I think that the world today would say that the man of God is a fool, and that all of his dreams of an afterlife have clouded his thinking. One of the most foolish things that they think that we do is give money as tithes to the church. They think that's a big waste of money. And they think that everybody behind the pulpit is just a scam artist that's preaching solely for the purpose of getting your money. That's what they think about us. They think that we're ridiculous. Well, I'd say that we believe the impossible, but not the ridiculous. Not even close. And our investments should be in eternal things, since that's where our real treasure belongs. We should be good stewards of what God has so graciously given to us, but you couldn't apply the proverb to Abraham that goes, a fool and his money are soon parted. He didn't have strange business ventures. He was a very wise and faithful steward in things that pertained to the kingdom of God. In verse 17 it reads, and the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field, and the cave which was therein, and all the trees that were in the field, that were in all the borders round about, were made sure unto Abraham for a possession in the presence of the children of Heth, before all that went in at the gate of this city. So it appears that this was more like a garden than a field. It was a garden with a cave rather than a field where he could plant crops. So it was really no big loss to Ephron, but it was a great place for Abraham to bury his wife. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And the field and the cave that is therein were made sure unto Abraham for a possession of a burying place by the sons of Heth. The name Machpelah means double or portion. Machpelah was right before Mamre, which means strength or fatness. So Mamre was a blessing in Abraham's life, but Machpelah was a double portion blessing in death. For precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. In this story, Abraham loses his wife, but he gains his son, as it were, raised from the dead. And Sarah enjoyed Isaac for just 37 years, but the whole time Isaac was growing up as a young man, he never got married, nor did he have any children. So Sarah, she never got to enjoy that special privilege of having a daughter-in-law and then seeing her grandchildren being born and growing up. And she's a princess, Sarah. She's a princess. As Abraham had many sons, Sarah had many daughters also. And even though she may not have seen them in her lifetime here on the earth, by faith, she knew that all the nations of the earth would be blessed in Isaac. And I can only imagine her joy in heaven to see all the sons and daughters of faith, even us, who learned so much by Abraham's example of faith and faithfulness, and by Sarah's example as well.